As well as being the chairman of the special interest group, he's a founding member of the WPA Evolutionary Psychiatry group and a consultant psychiatrist with the Mental Health Review Tribunal. And he will speak to us on eating disorders.
Yes, thank you very much, George. Right, my presentation is on eating disorders. As you will well know, eating disorders is an area that has seen a proliferation of theoretical formulations, but few, I would suggest, have significant explanatory value. And also, it's an area where the masses of data that have been collected thus far have failed to provide a coherent model for these disorders. It's my view that looking at eating disorders from an evolutionary perspective can provide new models and also suggest new avenues for research into these puzzling conditions. The most striking aspect of the epidemiology of eating disorders is their lopsided sex ratio. It's arguably the most lopsided sex ratio known to psychiatry. It's about 10 to 1 or greater in favor of females. There's a wide variation in the reported incidence and prevalence of anorexia and bulimia nervosa. Bulimia nervosa is found to be more common than anorexia in community surveys by a factor of about 3 to 1 or greater. Also, there is anecdotal evidence, strong anecdotal evidence that eating disorders are more prevalent in Western and Westernized societies. The core features of the eating disorders that I'll be focusing on are the morbid fear of fatness, distorted body image, and a pattern of behavior aimed at weight reduction that includes food restriction, purging, and exercise. So I'm just going to say a word about sexual selection, and the relevance of this will become apparent in a moment. So, Charles Darwin noted that not all traits aid survival, and in fact that some traits, in fact, hinder survival by, for instance, making the organism more vulnerable to predators. The canonical example of sexual selection is the peacock's tail. These are sexually selected traits. That's to say, traits that improve reproductive success through increasing the individual's attractiveness to the opposite sex. The whole issue of sexual selection has been clarified further by the introduction of the concept of the handicap principle, which proposes that sexually selected traits are not arbitrary, but are selected because they represent honest signals of genetic quality that are costly and difficult to fake. An interesting human analogy of this is the display of wealth as a proxy for genetic quality. Think about this. It's reasonably easy to fake a Rolex watch. It's a little bit more difficult to fake a Ferrari, and it is impossible to fake a mansion. I'm just being flippant here. There are numerous extant theories, evolutionary theories on eating disorders, but these are just 4 of them. The 2 in black propose that eating disorders are related to reproductive suppression. The one on the top suggests that eating disorders are a state of reproductive self-suppression, whereas the theory by Mealy suggests that eating disorders are reproductive suppression of subordinate females by dominant females. However, as weight loss or weight reduction and amenorrhea exist solely or even exclusively in anorexia nervosa, these theories are relevant mostly to anorexia. The two theories in red claim to be relevant to the whole range of eating disorders. For the remainder of my presentation, I will be focusing on the sexual competition hypothesis. Now, the sexual competition hypothesis places the phenomenon of eating disorders on a continuum, with the adaptive pursuit of thinness at one end and the maladaptive or pathological eating disorders at the other, with numerous states, intermediate states in between. The relevance of sexual selection to the sexual competition hypothesis is the fact that females possess sexually selected characteristics that serve the purpose of mate attraction and retention. These relate to the display of evidence of high mate value, primarily evidence of youth and good health. The major signal of the nubile shape, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment, that characterizes females at the peak of their reproductive potential. This visual signal has the purpose of attracting members of the opposite sex, as well as a competitive signal to rival females. So it's contended that in displaying physical characteristics of nubility, females are in fact displaying visual cues of high reproductive potential and or fertility. So the sexual competition hypothesis states that eating disorders are a manifestation of female intrasexual competition, whereby autonomous females of reproductive age compete intensely with each other in the novel environment of large cities through the display of signs of youth and nubility through a strategy of the pursuit of thinness. This leads to a state of runaway female intrasexual competition, the extreme version of which is eating disorders. So, in other words, the sexual competition hypothesis is based on the idea of a mismatch, and we've heard that in Annie's presentation, and I'm sure you will hear about mismatch further as the day goes on, as it is one of the major concepts that is introduced by evolution. So that there's a mismatch between the design of the human female's psychological adaptation for mate attraction and retention and for competing with rival females on the one hand and the modern human environment on the other. So to recap, the sexual competition hypothesis is based on the Darwinian theory of sexual selection that has led to the evolution of the female nubile shape. And as I said, I will say a little bit more in a moment about this. And the psychological drive to display visual cues of physical attractiveness, mainly signs of youth and good health. And that there are factors within the modern environment that have intensified female intrasexual competition, which include female autonomy, socially imposed monogamy, declining fertility, instability of mateships, media images, living in large cities, and so forth. These are the factors, I'm arguing, that create and intensify the mismatch. Youth has always been a major determinant of female reproductive potential and mate value, not least because of the unusual characteristic in human females of the female menopause. Now, female menopause is very rare in mammals, and we are one of the very, very few species that have this characteristic. In other mammals, well, the majority of them, the female reproduces throughout her lifespan. So, features of advancing age, certainly in a well-nourished environment, include weight gain, and in all environments, advancing age involves a deterioration in the hourglass nubile figure. In the ancestral environment, this occurred due to the repeated cycles of gestation and lactation. And therefore, in a well-nourished environment, slimness is associated with youthfulness, and there is data, empirical data, to support this claim. Just a word about the concept of the waist-to-hip ratio. There appears to be a universal male preference for a particular waist-to-hip ratio that provided a visual signal in the ancestral environment for the female's reproductive potential, reproductive history, as well as to current fertility. And this is how it's measured. The most attractive, it seems, waist-to-hip ratio to males in females is somewhere between 0.7 and 0.8, and it can be slightly higher in some cultures. A large study by Swami and colleagues that surveyed about 7,500 subjects from 26 countries, 10 regions of the world. Their main findings were that the vast majority of their subjects showed a broadly similar body shape preference. Rural areas preferred relatively heavier bodies. Lower socioeconomic status individuals preferred relatively heavier bodies. Increased exposure to Western media predicted preference for thinner bodies. And, interestingly, females consistently misconstrued males as preferring thinner bodies than is the case. This is actually a recurrent finding through a whole range of studies and gives us a clue that what's going on here is female-female intrasexual competition rather than female-male intersexual competition, which is a different process. Now, just a word about the role of culture. Some might think that because I'm invoking evolutionary processes, I'm saying that culture does not matter. Now, this is definitely not the case. We should remember that the capacity for culture has arisen through biological evolution. And since then, human psychology and biology have been shaped by a complex process of gene-culture co-evolution. And there's also the added issue of cumulative cultural evolution, but I'm not going to go there just at the moment. It's important to note that not all cultural content has the same ability to spread within a population, so that certain cultural content can engage our emotions and our evolved psychological mechanisms better than others. And under the right circumstances, these cultural variants that can do this will spread at the expense of alternatives. Or, as Fessler and Navarrete eloquently put it, some ideas are good to think precisely because they interdigitate with evolved psychological mechanisms, the output of which are often experienced as emotions, and this accounts for the widespread distribution of a small number of concepts across disparate cultures. Now, I would suggest that the whole area of the evolutionary biology of culture is one that evolutionary psychiatrists should pay more attention to, certainly more attention than they have done so far. So I would suggest that the sexual competition hypothesis can explain a range of basic findings of eating disorders that has eluded other theories, which basic facts such as why females, why reproductive age, and why the particular geographical distribution of eating disorders, as well as giving an explanation for the continuum model. Also, in my original article in '98, I made a number of predictions that flow from this hypothesis. One is that eating disorder patients will show higher level of intrasexual competition compared to controls, that societies with high fertility will show lower rates of eating disorders, that increasing female autonomy in a given society will be associated with increase in eating disorders, and that high stability of long-term mateships should be associated with lower rates of eating disorders and vice versa. And finally, that exclusive lesbians should have a lower risk of eating disorders, whereas exclusive male homosexuals are higher risk. The ones in red are the ones where there is empirical evidence to support these predictions. So I'll now turn to some data from non-clinical studies. I have personally been involved in a couple of non-clinical of studies of non-clinical populations to test the sexual competition hypothesis. The two studies, one is the Arizona study that was published in 2005, and the other one was a study conducted in Loughborough in the UK, and that was published in 2012. Both of these studies are questionnaire studies, so obviously that's a limitation. A further limitation is that they looked exclusively at university students, and obviously that's another special population. So this is the general characteristics of the Arizona population. Around 200 women were surveyed. The three types of questionnaires were used. One that measured competition. Well, it's three questionnaires, actually, that measures competition, general competitiveness, competition for status, and competition for mates. The hypothesis that we were testing at the time was that anorexia would be more related to competition for status, whereas bulimia would be more related to competition for mates. The other two types of questionnaire was the eating behavior questionnaire, the EDI, and two forms of mate value inventory. And I'm not going to present the actual data. You can look that up. But the conclusions from that study was that anorexic and bulimic behaviors were found to be ultimately driven by female intrasexual competition for mates. Remember that this was a non-clinical sample. What we looked at was not anorexia and bulimia nervosa, but anorexic and bulimic behaviors. And that although there was certainly a greater role with anorexic behaviors and competition for status, the main thrust was that this ultimately was driven by competition for mates. And therefore, the conclusion from that study was that the data supported the sexual competition hypothesis. The Loughborough study replicated the same questionnaires used by the Arizona study, but with the addition of a life history strategy measure. You've already heard from Annie about life history strategy. I will, and you will hear much more from Martin in the afternoon. But for those of you who may be unfamiliar with the concept, life history theory applies to all living beings. The assumption is that all life, well, it's a fact, exists in a world of finite resources, and therefore time and energy expended on a given task cannot be reutilized. So the very basic choices are either to invest in somatic effort to build up the body for future reproduction, or to engage in immediate reproductive effort. and engaging in immediate reproductive effort or reproductive effort can involve either parental effort or mating effort. Parental effort refers to producing small number of offspring and investing a large amount in each, or mating effort is producing a large number of offspring and investing a little in each. The choices on the right-hand side of this flowchart are referred to as slow life history strategies, whereas the choices on the left-hand side of the chart are referred to as fast life history strategies. And there have been claims, and maybe well-founded claims, that this can become the basis for a re-examination of the classification of mental disorder. Certainly it has implications for personality traits and for risk of psychopathology. So this is a general characteristics of the Loughborough population we looked at, just over 200 females, university students. Again, I'm not going to give you the results, but the conclusions from that study was that in a non-clinical population, abnormal eating attitudes and behaviors were predicted by intrasexual competition for mates and fast life history strategy. I didn't say what the rationale of the use of life history strategy in eating disorders. The hypothesis was that bulimia would be associated with more fast life history strategies, whereas anorexia would be associated with slow life history strategy. However, we were unable to test this hypothesis in this particular study because this was a non-clinical population with very few anorexics. And therefore, what we found was that there was a correlation between abnormal eating behaviors and a fast life history strategy. And that might be reflective of the fact that there were much more bulimics than there were anorexics. The data from a completely separate research group from the University of Texas looked at intrasexual competition in heterosexual and homosexual individuals. They conducted 2 studies. Their study design was to ask their subjects to complete an eating behavior questionnaire, which is the EAT-26. Then they prompted them for competition, and they asked them to rate themselves on that questionnaire a second time. In their first study, they looked at males and females, and when they did this, on the second rating, females increased their score on the eating questionnaire after they were prompted for competition, whereas males did not. In the second study, they had 4 subgroups, male and female, homosexual and heterosexual individuals. And what they found was that heterosexual females and homosexual males increased their scores after being prompted for competition, whereas the heterosexual males and lesbians did not, which is exactly what was predicted by my original article. Now, in the last couple of decades, there has been a considerable interest in a new clinical variant of men who present with distorted body image that involve intense feelings that their upper body is too small. And rather than having a drive for thinness, they have a drive for muscularity. Looking at this phenomenon through the prism of intrasexual competition, it's clear that females compete through the display of signs of youth and fertility. Men compete through the display of physical dominance and prowess, where the display of the size and muscularity of the upper body is an important visual signal. Hence, I would suggest that the sexual competition hypothesis is the most parsimonious explanation for the whole range of eating disorders, that's to say, the female version, which is the drive for thinness, as well as this male version, which is a drive for muscularity. Now, I can only say a few words about this because this is an unpublished study conducted by Martin Brunner's group in Germany, where for the first time the sexual competition hypothesis was put to the test in a clinical setting, looking at a modest number of anorexic and bulimic patients, comparing them with controls, using similar measures as our Loughborough study. The main conclusions was that there was a difference between the bulimic population and the anorexic and controls, with the bulimics having scoring higher on competition for mates and fast life history. So the sexual competition hypothesis seemed to have been supported there for bulimics, but not for anorexic patients. Possible explanations could be that anorexia and bulimia have distinct evolutionary roots, or that there are some issues with regards to the classification of eating disorders. Some suggest that anorexia itself can be subdivided into anorexia nervosa restrictive type and anorexia nervosa binging, purging type, the latter being more closely related to bulimia nervosa. Or it could be the fact that the sample size was small. Obviously, what is required next after the study is published, of course, is to look at the conclusions of this study and maybe plan further research, maybe on a larger population, taking the conclusions of this study into account. So, what's the value of this? It's a novel approach to the investigation of the etiology of eating disorders, of eating psychopathology. It has the potential for incorporation into clinical assessment of patients. It has the potential for incorporation into psychological therapy. There's already examples of this with media literacy programs where eating disorder patients are shown how the media manipulate the images of models and so forth through Photoshop and things like that, and how they remove all blemishes. They even alter certain parts of the model's body and so forth. And this seems to have a beneficial effect through, the idea is to reduce the intensity of the female intrasexual competition. Conclusion: extant theories of eating disorders, I would suggest, have poor explanatory value and make no testable predictions. The sexual competition hypothesis is a Darwinian formulation based on gene-environment interaction model. It has been supported by evidence from non-clinical populations and partially supported by one clinical study, and that the theory has the potential for being used in the assessment and treatment of eating disorder patients. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Riadh, for completing this morning's presentations with an interesting talk. We have a lot of time, so what I'm going to do is take some questions first for Riadh only, and then I'll invite the previous speakers to come and join us up here for further questions.
Thank you very much, Riadh. I've followed your work with interest, as you know, and I remember an article in the British Journal of Psychiatry, The Evolution of Eating Disorders, which actually was the development, not the evolution, and you mentioned this to them. And they retorted to you, anorexia nervosa can't have an evolutionary basis because it didn't increase survival, and the amenorrhea didn't increase reproduction. Therefore, it cannot be evolutionary. And I just wondered if you'd like, especially as you're on camera now, to give a proper answer to that, which you were never able to come back to them on.
Thank you very much, Paul. Yes, the question was the objection to the sexual competition hypothesis or to any evolutionary explanation of eating disorders, certainly of anorexia, because anorexia nervosa reduces reproduction or reproductive success due to amenorrhea. Now, the observation that it does reduce reproductive success is correct. However, the dismissal of evolutionary explanation is incorrect, because that is a misunderstanding of the utility of the evolutionary framework, the application of the evolutionary framework to the understanding of mental disorder, specifically the misunderstanding of the whole concept of mismatch. And this has been this term or concept has been repeated several times during this morning. It is incorrect to just look at the utility of the evolutionary framework in the context of is a given set of symptoms adaptive? It can be maladaptive, but still has an evolutionary explanation. The example that Annie gave in her presentation of overeating and the problem of obesity is a case in point. The fact that we have an epidemic of obesity now obviously is harmful. So the same argument about how can that have an evolutionary explanation? Well, if you change the environment beyond what our genes expect, then you will have consequences. And the consequences can only be understood in terms of the interaction between the traits that we have inherited and the novel aspects of the environment. So that would be my short answer. A longer answer would be over coffee or something.
Here, yes, and then back there.
The question was whether my original article can be sent. It can be accessed through ResearchGate. It is on my page on ResearchGate, and that's open to anyone. So anyone who goes on the ResearchGate website and searches my name, they can get that article easily. So, thanks. Thank you very much.
The gentleman at the back, yes.
Thank you very much for the talk. My question really is about the specificity of the sexual competition hypothesis to eating disorders, and whether it generalizes to other conditions such as, for instance, ADHD, certain types of personality disorder, bipolar disorder.
My answer to that is that intrasexual competition is a universal for all sexually reproducing organisms. So that the process of intrasexual competition is certainly is not specific to eating disorders. It's not specific to humans. It is a universal phenomenon that occurs in all sexual organisms. So that's one point I would agree that there are universal issues with regards to the concept of intrasexual competition. The consequences of intrasexual competition can be specific to gender and obviously to the species. So the consequences of intrasexual competition in men can be distinct from those in women, and they can also be distinct given the range of environmental conditions. So the way that intrasexual competition results or gives rise to its consequences is very context related. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. There's a young lady there at the end of the second row.
Yeah, so my question is, so alongside the media's obsession with thinness of women, there's been an increasing trend on social media of positive role models of like YouTube stars, Instagram stars who look normal or plus size. They model clothes, they look fairly normal, and they post pictures of themselves with all their sort of lumps and bumps. And they often have millions of followers. This is an increasing trend. So my question is, do you think that this phenomenon can in any way reverse our evolutionary obsession with thinness?
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks for that. She's my daughter, by the way. And well, I just want to correct one issue, is that the drive for thinness is not an evolutionary, necessarily an evolutionary drive. It is a drive that occurs within the context of the novel environment of modern cities, where we live in abnormally large, amongst abnormally large numbers of other humans, which is not the natural state that humans have lived in or have evolved in. So, so going back to the question, will normalization of the shape of models in the media, will that reverse the process of drive for thinness? It can do, but of course that is one factor. I don't think that media images are the only factor here, but it's one. It's one factor amongst many. I can't predict whether that will reverse or reduce the prevalence of eating disorders, but it might contribute to it. But I don't know that I can predict either way.
The lady at the back there with the white hair.
How distinct do you think that the sexual competition for status and the sexual competition for mates are?
Can you repeat the question
How
and raise your voice a bit?
No, it's how distinct the sexual competition for mates as opposed to status are from each other.
Yes, that's it.
Right. How distinct? Well, that's a good question. I've had my doubts as to whether these are completely separate issues. But I'm assured by my psychologist colleague, Professor Figueiredo, who designed these measures, that they measure distinct traits or motivations. But from an evolutionary perspective, I think what is the aim of status if it was not reproduction? So the competition for mates and status must be linked somehow, and not totally separate in terms of the biological hierarchy. So I don't have a better answer than that, but I think they may not be completely separate.
So first there, and then over here there's a question. And the second question over here.
Hi, it's a very fascinating presentation. My question is in regards to the next step. So what do we seem to have like a better understanding of the evolutionary hypothesis of eating disorders. So what's the next step then? I mean, is there like a provision for or a theory for adapting psychological treatment in order to incorporate evolutionary aspects in order to get for the patient to have a better understanding of why they are or why they have such disorders? And then I just wonder whether that's the next step, or do you have answers to that?
I don't know what value it will have, but there is certainly the potential for it to to be valuable if if this is supported by clinical studies. I mean, for instance, I'm kind of guessing, I'm not an eating disorder specialist myself, I'm guessing that the whole issue of mate value, intrasexual competition, and so forth, doesn't come into any of the assessment of our eating disorder patients nowadays. So these are areas that clinicians are blind to, and they are not touched upon. They don't form part of the current assessments, and therefore this is a potential area where we can start to look at our patients. I mean, for instance, if the finding that, for instance, bulimic patients have a significantly higher level of intrasexual competition for mates, to know this may be a valuable fact, both in terms of the clinician and the patient, and then there may be ways of actually starting to tackle this through psychological therapies. So I can't predict how the interventions and the assessments will progress, but what I would suggest is that this kind of research has the potential of being useful, but maybe 1 or 2 steps down the line.
So 2 more questions for Dr. Riadh, and maybe Fanny and Professor Tracy could come up here so we open the questions again, please. So 2 more questions for Dr. Abed.
Can I just explore the correlation with population density a little bit further? Because you said that eating disorders and anorexia are associated with large cities, and if you like, it's a maladaptive response to large population densities.
Yes.
But the disorder doesn't spread equally across social class within clinical population. It's much higher in the higher social classes. And that's the inverse of population density within those groups, because the lower social classes are generally in much more dense population situations than the higher social classes. So how does that make sense?
My understanding is that applies to anorexia nervosa. Well, I've got Agnes here saying it doesn't even apply to anorexia, but my reading of the literature is that this doesn't apply to the whole of eating disorders. There are some studies that have suggested that I've looked at, and I see that Agnes doesn't agree, but the studies that I've looked at suggest that anorexia may have that character, but that doesn't apply. That's a small minority of the eating disorder population. The eating disorder population are not biased towards the higher classes. So that would be my main reply to that. But you know, there's obviously a whole issue about. I mean, population density is not the only factor here, and regardless, it seems, of where we live now in the world, we are still abnormally bombarded by other people, by other people's lives, from the media, from whatever, in a way that our pre-existing biology has not prepared us for.
Front here, please.
As a child psychiatrist with a special interest in eating disorders, we're seeing young people at much younger ages now presenting, so both boys and girls age 8, 9, 10, who are well below puberty,
Yes.
And may present with an initial pursuit of control rather than pursuit of thinness. And I wonder whether you see this as a separate group with a separate hypothesis, or whether this group also can fit within your hypothesis.
Well, a good question. The question is about the the reducing age or the younger age groups that are now presenting with eating disorders. Of course, pre-pubertal presentation of eating disorders would be a challenge for the sexual competition hypothesis, without a doubt. But they remain a minority, is my understanding, in terms of the prevalence or the incidence of eating disorders. But they are a challenge. Do they have does my hypothesis suggest that they may have a separate etiology? Possible, that is certainly possible. I mean, from the findings of Martin Bruner's group, it might well be that anorexia nervosa itself has a, or at least a subgroup of it, has a separate evolutionary explanation to other eating disorders. So the answer is yes. We need to keep an open mind about new variants of this condition, and I'm not suggesting at all that one size fits all.
So you can ask any speaker now